Last month, many of you were here when Susie Lindemann gave us an entertaining account of her trip to her family's ancestral home in Transylvania, in Romania, with some comments about the early days of Unitarianism there. After hearing her story, my first thought was, how did a relatively unknown area of southeastern Europe become home to a relatively unknown and definitely unorthodox young faith 500 years ago? And I use the term unorthodox deliberately, meaning not correct, as far as mainstream European religious traditions go. That area of Europe has long been a center of trade routes as well as ongoing battles between empires with strong political forces all around it. While all this was true, it was also true that this area was a very long way from the religious centers of Western Europe and active inquisitions designed to keep the Christian faithful on a strict path. Did this have anything to do with it? We'll see. I know that this UU fellowship has a large number of atheists and agnostics. I know that we also have some among us who believe in God. I hope that this talk today will remind all of us that the founders of Unitarianism did also believe in God, and that a belief in God is as old as history. My talk today is more about the history of Unitarianism and how it got started in the southeast of Europe. Most of us are familiar with the 19th and 20th century story of Unitarianism and its merger with Universalism in the mid-20th century. But I didn't remember ever hearing much about the earliest rumblings of the faith that would come to be known as Unitarianism, or how it got started. What captured my attention while researching this subject is the fact that 500 years ago, the very earliest people who called themselves Unitarian were closely allied to both Judaism and Islam in the Eastern European countries where it all began. There were shared services, practices, debates, conferences, and the other normal activities that any organization does to involve its members and promote its ideas in the community. Some of you here may be familiar with the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker, a noted UU minister and professor emerita of theology. She reflects that UUs have an ancestry many of us have not known. Most UUs are familiar with the standard account of our history. We teach children about our New England roots, the pilgrims who risked everything to claim their religious freedom, the Boston reformers and literati who advanced social reform, the 20th century religious humanists who revered science, worked for civil rights, and called us to care for this world. My research revealed the ancestry of UU at the intersections of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity in 16th century Eastern Europe. Born in this multicultural and multi-religious society, early Unitarianism resisted establishing a Christian identity which opposed Islam and Judaism, and instead worked to foster religious views and practices that expressed kinship and mutual respect among the three traditions. I discovered that you can find Muslim prayer rugs in Unitarian churches in Eastern Europe, that the 16th century Edict of Toleration has passages that are directly traceable to Islamic texts. These earliest Unitarians developed a multi-religious community following a path marked by peaceful, positive, and creative interchange among Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Rather than clinging to an anti-creedal rebelliousness as the hallmark of their Unitarian identity, these first Unitarians worked toward a multi-religious interchange of cultures as a defining characteristic of this new identity. North American Unitarians have less sense of the interreligious movement than Unitarians in Europe, Asia, and Africa, since we came late to the party. Unitarianism can be found in many places: India, the Philippines, Uganda, Peru. In North Africa, the word Unitarianism is synonymous with Andalusian, the term that in the Muslim world refers to the nearly 700-year period in Spain and North Africa, during which, under the Muslim Caliphate, Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted in peaceful interaction that produced a flowering of the arts, architecture, music, medicine, and scholarship. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The Council of Nicaea in 325 formally separated the early church from its Jewish origins by formally establishing that Jesus and God shared in the same divine substance. Up until then, the early church had permitted a variety of understandings on the nature of Jesus as teacher or prophet, but not as God. After Nicaea, Christians had to subscribe to a creed that asserted that Jesus was also divine. Those who, for whatever reasons, did not accept this theology were branded heretics, were declared anathema, and cast out of the church. Christianity was trying desperately to separate itself from Judaism. Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, on the right, was very forceful in promoting the need to separate the new faith from the Jewish faith. Part of his agenda in this was to discredit another bishop, Arius, the one on the left, a distinguished theologian and much-loved cleric of the time. Arius did not accept the divinity of Jesus. He believed that Jesus was begotten. You're all familiar with all the begats in the Old Testament, meaning that there was a time before his birth when he did not exist, as opposed to God, who is eternal. Athanasius, however, thought the new church needed a different divinity, one that could not be confused with the existing regional gods. Athanasius won this argument, and the young church, at his bidding, accepted a divinity that was composed of both God and Jesus. The doctrine that Arius advocated, that Jesus and God were not both divine, became known as Arianism and became a heresy that was maintained for centuries. At the Council of Constantinople in 381, the Holy Spirit was formally added as the third part of the Godhead, and the doctrine of the Trinity became official. Christianity was deliberately alienated from its closest relatives, Judaism and the paganism of the ancient world. Christians could now claim to have a unique God, a God just for them. No longer could anyone say that they believed in the same God as their neighbors. The new doctrines also uncoupled the connection between Easter and Passover, which for years had provided a rich source of interreligious dialogue. Many people of the time refused and resented this enforced separation. Many of the Jewish communities, and a couple centuries later, the Islamic communities, were quite comfortable with the concept of a shared God. Insistence on the unity and sameness of a God of many traditions lay at the very heart of the prophet's revelation on Mount Hira in 610. Some Arabs practicing their religion already believed that the God, Allah, that they worshipped was the same God as that of the Jews and the Christians. Muhammad's experience and teachings transformed this belief into accepted Islamic revelation. The Roman Church was able to maintain its control in most areas, but was never able to enforce its doctrines on the edges of Christendom. This was the case in the late medieval Muslim-ruled state of Al-Andalus, approximately 750 to 1492. For the most part tolerant and multicultural, the Caliphate of Al-Andalus was a beacon of the possibility of peaceful coexistence. When the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims, began in 1492 under their most Catholic majesties, Ferdinand and Isabella, that was their formal titles, the first goal was the expulsion of all Muslims from the land. Close behind it came the royal order expelling all Jews from Spain. Jews or Muslims could, in theory, convert and become conversos, but there were no guarantees, and many Jews and Muslims fled to the Islamic-ruled Middle East and areas of Eastern Europe under the Orthodox faith based out of Constantinople. Spain began to enact laws of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, which stated that Christian identity could be guaranteed only by a direct bloodline connection to families who had been Christian for many generations. These laws did what no previous laws had been able to do, which was to equate religious with racial purity. Historians suggest that this obsessive linkage of racial purity and religion gave birth to modern anti-Semitism, the prejudice against Jews on account of their racial identity, as opposed from anti-Judaism, which is based on religious identity. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks seized power in the Middle East and established another empire of multiculturalism and religious toleration, just as the Caliphate in Spain was coming to an end. During the decades following the Reconquista, many independent and brilliant thinkers who fled Spain ranged across Europe or fled to the new Ottoman-ruled areas in the East in search of toleration. One of these was Michael Servetus, a liberal Jew who lived for a while in France, where he worked under an assumed name as an editor and later as a physician. A fervent anti-Trinitarian. Notice that they are not Unitarians yet. He published works against the accepted Christian doctrine, expounding a tolerant and open doctrine. Unloved by the Roman Church, he was also unloved by the newer anti-Catholic Protestants. He sent a copy of one of his tracts to John Calvin in Geneva. Calvin was no fonder of him than the Inquisition had been, and had him executed in Geneva in 1553. Servetus is often cited as one of the primary influences on the founders of modern Unitarianism. The next generation of anti-Trinitarians included a man named Jacob Paleologus. Paleologus lived from approximately 1520 to 1585, and was one of many who provided the link between Servetus's theology and the purposeful establishment of Unitarian churches. In Poland, in Transylvania, and in Lithuania, this new breed gathered religious communities around the anti-Trinitarian ideas inspired by Servetus. Paleologus provided one of the first comprehensive articulations within early Unitarianism of a natural kinship between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. After a theological paper he wrote on Revelation attracted the attention of the Inquisition, he moved to Prague in 1559 and lived there as a scholar of the Middle East and of the Quran. There, too, he began identifying himself as a Unitarian, entering into correspondence with Francis David, the leader of what would become the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. During these same years, many Jews from Western Christian lands were moving east into Ottoman-controlled areas or into the fringe areas of Eastern Europe. Poland, Lithuania, Transylvania, and Turkey all provided relatively safe and occasionally even welcoming areas for the Jews. Anti-Trinitarian scholars already living there found they shared ideas in common with these new arrivals. Following the Reformation, Christian churches in these outlying areas were less concerned with conformity to Roman doctrine and were more interested in hearing what these other believers had to say. Public debates were held among Jews and other anti-Trinitarians. At one debate, so the story goes, the specific request was made that no language that was not biblically based, which meant the Torah or Old Testament, be allowed into the debate, thereby removing in one sweep any discussion of the Trinity. The Ottoman Empire, by and large, allowed regional kings to maintain their kingdoms and provided a political culture of tolerance. One of these regional kings was John Sigismund, king of Hungary and governor of Transylvania, born in 1540. Transylvania at this time served as a buffer state between areas directly controlled by the Habsburg, the Austro-Hungarian ruling house, and the Ottomans. It became one of the safest places in Europe for the development of progressive Protestantism. In 1568, King John Sigismund, newly converted to Unitarianism, issued the Edict of Torda, which historians celebrate as the first European policy statement of expansive religious tolerance. Rather than establishing his own faith as the national religion and compelling his people to adopt it, the usual practice among rulers, the edict made it legal for his subjects to practice their own religious traditions. It allowed congregations to pick their own preachers, keeping church and state authorities from posing unpopular theology on the people. Traditional accounts hold that Sigismund's brilliant Unitarian court preacher, Francis David, on the left, was singularly responsible for inspiring the ruler to issue the Edict of Torda. Another member of the royal court, Giorgio Biantrata, is known in Unitarian history as the person most instrumental in coalescing anti-Trinitarian theologies into an intentional Unitarian church. The importance of the tolerance and openness of the Ottoman rulers to religious and cultural diversity cannot be overestimated or overappreciated in the flowering of the new religion. The Ottomans permitted a variety of religious and cultural expressions for reasons of bureaucratic expediency in their expanding empire, but tolerance was also deeply rooted in their own legal, cultural, and religious traditions. Any monotheist willing to accept the political rule of the Ottomans was given protection and legal rights by the empire. As a result, both Jews and Unitarians paid a special tax and in return were treated the same as Muslim subjects. Toleration thus derived from Ottoman policy, Ottoman bureaucratic structure, and Ottoman interpretation of Islam, which was in most instances stunningly liberal, cosmopolitan, and pluralistic. As anti-Semitism increased elsewhere in Europe, Jews found the Ottoman Empire an enormously hospitable place, and a learned diasporic community grew and thrived within its borders. Ottoman flexibility also allowed Unitarians to publish some of their more radical literature in Turkey and smuggle it into Transylvania. By the late 16th century, Jews in the northern regions of Eastern Europe were becoming increasingly persecuted as some of the ideas of racial purity filtered north from the Spanish Inquisition. By the 17th century, Unitarians, as they were known by now, were occasionally threatened with persecution if they didn't distance themselves from their Jewish practices and support of the Jewish communities. Unfortunately, subsequent centuries have seen the history of the Islamic Ottoman influence on Transylvanian Unitarianism rewritten, as revisionism has emphasized the importance of Hungarian and Slavic patriotism, with a corresponding animosity to an Islamic religious and political enemy. One of the political results of the Reformation was an identification of Hungarian patriotism with liberal Protestantism. Hungarian nationalists have represented Unitarianism as a national religion, sprung fresh and whole from Hungarian soil. Crediting their historical enemy, the Ottoman Empire, later the country of Turkey, with having inspired Unitarianism is theologically, ethnically, and politically threatening. The development of Unitarianism in North America in the 17th and 18th centuries was subject to the anti-individualism and need for conformity among the early New England Puritans. Tolerance for conflicting opinions was also not high on the list for early Congregationalists, even though Unitarianism did eventually grow out of the liberal wing of that faith. Unitarianism has provided a tightrope that North American religious communities have had to walk. One side being the doctrines of the mainstream Protestant churches, the faith in the Trinity, and thereby an acceptance by the larger community. And the other side being a too extreme individualism that would allow inclusion of other belief systems which would pull away from the underlying faith in a single God. Unitarian Universalism around the world is showing an increasing presence of both Jews and Muslims in their congregations, and an appreciation of a variety of practices that these other faiths can bring to it. Reverend Matt has spoken to us on several occasions about the joining of Unitarianism with Universalism, the belief that all souls everywhere are welcome to the company of the faithful. Baptism or another ceremonial rite that provides entry to that group is not required. Unitarian Universalism is indeed a unique faith that welcomes us all. May it be so.